She had not spoken her own name in 4 years, not once, not to the servants who brought her meals on a separate tray, not to the tradesmen who were instructed to address her only as companion, not to the women at the assembly rooms who looked through her as though she were a draught coming in under the door rather than a person standing in it. 4 years, 1,461 days of being called nothing, of answering to a function instead of a name, of watching her own identity be folded up like a letter no one intended to send and placed in a drawer that no one intended to open. And then, on a Tuesday evening in April of 1843, at a dinner party she had not been invited to attend but had been ordered to serve, a man she had never met turned to her with grey eyes that missed nothing and asked a question so simple it nearly broke her in half. "What is your name?" She opened her mouth, and nothing came out. Not because she had forgotten it. She knew her name the way a prisoner knows the number of stones in the wall. She knew it because it was the last thing her father had spoken before he died, his hand on her cheek, his breath shallow, his voice already fading. "Eleanor," he had said. "My Eleanor, remember who you are." She knew it because she wrote it every night in the margin of whatever book she was reading, pressing the pencil so hard the graphite shone like scar tissue on the page. A small private act of defiance, so quiet that no one in the house had ever noticed. But speaking it, saying it aloud to another human being, hearing it exist in the air between herself and someone who was actually looking at her, that was something she had not done since the autumn of 1839, when her aunt had taken her by the arm in the entrance hall of Ashton House and said, in a voice as calm and final as a coffin lid closing, "You will not use your name in this household. You are my companion. That is what you are. That is what you will answer to. If, the servants ask, you are Miss Companion. If the guests ask, you are no one." And so she had become no one. For 4 years, until this man, this tall, broad-shouldered, sharp-jawed stranger with ink stains on his right cuff that he had clearly tried and failed to scrub away, this man who had no business noticing her, let alone speaking to her, let alone asking a question that contained more dignity than she had been offered in 1,500 days, this man looked at her and waited. He did not look away. He did not repeat the question. He did not fill the silence with the embarrassed small talk that most people used when they had accidentally addressed the wrong person at a dinner party. He simply waited with the patient, focused attention of someone who understood that some answers take time to surface, and that the waiting is not a burden, but a courtesy. She felt something shift in her chest, a door that had rusted shut 4 years ago, groaning on its hinges. Her throat burned, her eyes stung. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her dishwater-colored skirt, were trembling so badly she pressed them flat against her thighs to keep them still. "Eleanor," she said. Her voice cracked on the second syllable. She heard it break, heard the years of disuse in the roughness of the sound, and she felt her face heat with a shame so old and so familiar that it was almost comfortable. But she did not stop. She would not stop. Not now. Not with this man looking at her as though her answer mattered. "Eleanor Graves." The man did not smile. He did not offer pity or surprise or the performative kindness of someone who has glimpsed suffering and wants to demonstrate that they have noticed it without actually doing anything about it. He simply inclined his head, the way one might acknowledge an equal, and said, "Miss Graves, my name is Hale." She would learn later that he had not told her his full name on purpose, that the man standing before her with ink on his cuff and the weight of 40,000 pounds a year behind his quiet grey eyes, was Sebastian Hale, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, the most powerful man in the House of Lords, the most feared debater in parliamentary history, and the owner of more land than some European principalities. She would learn that he had come to Lady Ashton's dinner not for the food or the company or the social currency that such events provided, but because he was hunting for someone, a ghost, a mind without a face, a writer whose words had kept him awake at night for 2 years, and whose identity remained the single unsolved puzzle in a life that had otherwise been catalogued, controlled, and comprehensively mastered. She would learn all of that. But in this moment, standing in the corner of Lady Ashton's overcrowded dining room, in a dress the color of dishwater that had been chosen specifically because it rendered her invisible, Eleanor Graves knew only this: a man had asked her name, and she had remembered how to say it. And something in the way he said Miss Graves, with a weight and a precision that suggested he intended to remember it, told her that the next 4 years of her life were going to be nothing like the last. Can I tell you something? There is a reason stories like this have been told for centuries. It is not the gowns, it is not the grand estates or the titles or the candlelight reflected in crystal. It is this moment, the moment someone looks at you and asks who you are, not what you do, not what you are useful for, who you are. Welcome to Duke of Hearts Romance. Tonight I have that kind of story for you. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from right now? What city, what country, what time of day? I want to picture you there. Whether you are curled up in bed with the lights low, or driving through traffic, or sitting in a quiet room after everyone else has gone to sleep, I want you to know that you are not listening alone. We are all here, together. Tonight's story is about a woman whose name was taken from her, not by violence, not by law, by something quieter and in many ways more devastating, by the systematic, daily, relentless erasure of her identity by the woman who was supposed to protect her. It is about a man who had everything the world could offer: wealth, power, title, influence, and who discovered that the only thing he actually wanted was a conversation with a person who would tell him the truth. And it is about what happens when those two people find each other. When the woman who had been turned into no one meets the man who has been searching for her without knowing her face. When the words she wrote in secret become the bridge between his loneliness and her silence. But more than anything, it is about a name, the simplest, most fundamental thing a person possesses, the first thing we are given and the last thing we should ever lose, and what it costs to take it back. Let me take you there. The village of Hartfield sat in the green folds of Hertfordshire, 20 miles north of London and a century behind it. It had a coaching inn that served tolerable ale and intolerable food, a church with a Norman tower, and a vicar who preached sermons of such unrelenting dullness that even the pigeons fell asleep, and a high street that could be walked end to end in the time it took to drink a cup of tea. It was the kind of place that people described as charming when they meant nothing happens here, and peaceful when they meant nothing will ever happen here. Ashton House stood on a small rise at the eastern edge of the village, visible from the London road, which was precisely the point. Lady Vivian Ashton had purchased the house in 1836, not because she admired its Georgian proportions or its walled garden or the lime-tree avenue that led from the gate to the front door, but because every carriage travelling between London and the northern counties would see it, and seeing it would know that Lady Ashton lived in a house of consequence. Consequence was the currency Lady Ashton traded in. Not money. She had enough of that. inherited from a husband who had the good fortune to invest in canals and the even better fortune to die before the railways made them obsolete. Not beauty, she had possessed it once and spent it decades ago. Not kindness, she had never possessed that at all. What Lady Ashton had was position. She had a name that appeared on guest lists. She had a drawing-room where opinions were formed and reputations destroyed. She had a daughter, Beatrice, who was 22 and golden-haired and destined, if Lady Ashton had anything to say about it, for a title and a fortune that would elevate the Ashton name from the comfortable obscurity of the gentry into the glittering orbit of the aristocracy. And she had Eleanor. Now it is important to understand what it meant to be a companion in 1843 England, because the word itself is one of the great hypocrisies of the era. A companion was, in theory, a gentlewoman of reduced circumstances who provided company and assistance to a woman of higher social standing. She was not a servant. She ate at the family table, wore respectable clothing, and was addressed with the courtesy due to someone of gentle birth. In practice, a companion was something far more ambiguous and far more vulnerable. She occupied a social no-man's land between the family and the staff, belonging to neither, protected by neither, visible to neither. She was expected to be useful without being paid, present without being acknowledged, grateful without being given anything to be grateful for. She was, in the blunt assessment of one social commentator of the period, a woman who has fallen far enough to need charity, but not far enough to receive it. The legal position was equally precarious. A companion had no contract, no formal employment, no rights. She served at the pleasure of her employer, which is a polite way of saying she existed at the mercy of someone who could dismiss her at any moment, for any reason, with no notice and no provision. In a society that offered unmarried women without means exactly three options: governessing, companionship, or destitution, the companion's dependence on her employer was not merely economic, it was existential. Eleanor Graves had arrived at Ashton House in September of 1839, 24 years old, newly orphaned, and carrying a single trunk that contained everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses, a woolen cloak, her father's pocket watch, a tortoise-shell comb that had been her mother's, and 14 notebooks filled with her own handwriting. Her father, Mr. Edmund Graves, had been a scholar. Not the kind of scholar who held a university chair and published monographs that other scholars cited in footnotes. The other kind. The kind who read everything, understood everything, owned nothing, and died in a rented house in Cheapside with £17 in his bank account and £400 in debts. Edmund Graves had been the second son of a gentleman of good family and poor judgment. He had chosen learning over commerce, books over property, ideas over income, and he had raised his daughter in the same tradition, teaching her Latin and Greek and mathematics and political economy and natural philosophy and every other subject that a man might learn at Oxford and a woman might learn nowhere at all. He taught her to think. He taught her to argue. He taught her to write with clarity and force and the kind of precision that leaves no room for misunderstanding. He taught her, without meaning to be exactly the kind of woman that 1843 England had no use for. When he died, Eleanor was at his bedside. She held his hand as the light went out of his eyes, and she felt the warmth leave his fingers by degrees, and she memorized the exact moment when the hand she was holding became simply weight, the moment between alive and gone, which is the smallest moment in the world and the largest. His debts were called in by his creditors within the week. The rented house was emptied. The books, Edmund's great collection, 4,000 volumes accumulated over 30 years of passionate, impractical devotion, were sold at auction for a sum so insulting that Eleanor could not bring herself to attend. She stood outside the auction house on Paternoster Row and listened to the hammer fall, each strike a small death, and she pressed her father's watch against her chest until the metal grew warm from her skin. She had no mother. Mrs. Graves had died of typhus when Eleanor was 11, leaving behind the tortoise-shell comb, a half-finished letter to a friend in Bath, and a daughter who would spend the rest of her life trying to remember the exact sound of her voice. She had no siblings. She had no close friends. Edmund's peripatetic habits had moved them from lodging to lodging too frequently for lasting attachments. She had no money, no property, no prospects, and no skills that the world was willing to pay for. What she had was an aunt. Lady Ashton was her mother's elder sister. The two women had not been close. And this is where I need to tell you something about Lady Ashton that does not excuse her but explains her, because understanding a villain is not the same as forgiving one, and the distinction matters. Vivienne and Anne Whitfield had been raised in a house where the father read Rousseau and the mother embroidered cushions, and from the beginning it was clear which daughter had inherited which parent's temperament. Anne was gentle, artistic, content with books and gardens and the slow pleasures of a quiet life. Vivienne was sharp. Vivienne was ambitious. Vivienne was, by every account, the cleverer of the two, quicker with numbers, more ruthless in argument, possessed of the kind of strategic intelligence that, had she been born male, would have made her a barrister or a politician or a very successful merchant. But Vivienne was not born male. She was born female in 1790, which meant that the intelligence that should have been her greatest asset became, instead, her greatest frustration. There was no Oxford for Vivienne, no barrister's chambers, no counting-house. There was marriage, which she pursued with the same strategic brilliance she would have applied to any other campaign, selecting Mr. Ashton not because she loved him, but because he was rich and inattentive, and would give her a household to run and a fortune to manage. And then her gentle, bookish sister had married Edmund Graves, a poor scholar, a man with nothing, and had been happy. Genuinely, visibly, infuriatingly happy. Happy in a way that Vivienne, with all her money and all her strategy, had never managed to be. The resentment calcified over the years into something harder and more specific. When Anne died, Vivienne felt nothing. When Edmund died and his daughter arrived on her doorstep, Anne's daughter, with Anne's face and Edmund's mind and the particular unbearable quality of being everything that Vivienne's intelligence had once aspired to and her circumstances had never allowed, the resentment found its target. Eleanor was what Vivienne might have been in a different life, a thinking woman, a writing woman, a woman whose mind was her defining feature, and so Vivienne did to Eleanor what the world had done to Vivienne. She erased her, not because Eleanor was worthless, but because Eleanor's brilliance made Vivienne's own buried potential impossible to deny. Every essay Eleanor wrote in secret was a mirror that Vivienne could not bear to look into. Every footnote, every argument, every precisely constructed sentence was a reminder that the cleverest woman in the Whitfield family had spent her intelligence on guest lists and social calendars instead of ideas. This does not make Lady Ashton sympathetic. It makes her comprehensible. And, in my experience, the cruelest people are not the ones who lack intelligence. They are the ones who had it and watched it go to waste, and who cannot forgive the world for the waste, or the people who remind them of it. The terms of Eleanor's captivity were established on her first evening at Ashton House, in the upstairs sitting-room, with the fire unlit because Lady Ashton believed that cold air promoted clarity of thought, though Eleanor suspected it simply promoted cold. "You will understand," Lady Ashton said, "that I am doing this out of duty to your mother's memory, not out of affection." "I understand," Eleanor said. "Good." Lady Ashton examined her the way a seamstress examines fabric, assessing not beauty or character, but utility. "You are plain. That is useful. Beatrice cannot afford competition in her own household." Eleanor said nothing. She was not, in fact, plain. She had the kind of face that required attention to see clearly. Strong brows, a determined jaw, brown eyes that held too much intelligence to be called soft and too much warmth to be called hard. In a ballroom full of porcelain beauties, she would have been overlooked. In a room of one, she would have been extraordinary. But Lady Ashton had no interest in looking closely, and people who do not look closely always mistake depth for dullness. "You are educated. That may be useful, if directed properly. You will assist Beatrice with her correspondence and her French, both of which are appalling. You will manage my social diary. You will accompany me to events where a companion is required." "Yes, Lady Ashton." "You will not use your name." The sentence landed like a slap. Eleanor blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Your name," Lady Ashton repeated, as though clarifying a simple instruction to a slow servant. "You will not use it. I have no intention of explaining to every drawing-room in Hertfordshire why my late sister's daughter is living in my house like a poor relation. You are my companion. That is your function. That is how you will be addressed. My name is Eleanor Graves." "Your name," Lady Ashton said, leaning forward with a precision that revealed exactly how much she had thought about this, "is whatever I say it is. You are in my house. You eat my food. You wear clothing purchased with my money. You exist because I permit it. And I do not permit Eleanor Graves to exist under this roof. Do I make myself clear?" It was not a question. It was an announcement. Eleanor, who had spent 24 years being taught by her father that a person's name was the foundation of their identity, that to name a thing was to give it power and to unname it was to take that power away, understood exactly what was being done to her. She also understood that she had nowhere else to go. "Yes, Lady Ashton." "Excellent. Your room is at the end of the servants' corridor. Mary will show you." The first year was the worst. Not because of the work, which was tedious but manageable. Not because of the room, which was small but clean. Not because of the food, which was adequate, though always served on a separate tray, as though her appetite might contaminate the family's. The worst part was the silence. Eleanor had spent her entire life in conversation. With her father, who could debate the merits of Hume versus Locke over breakfast and transition seamlessly to the migration patterns of Arctic terns by lunch. With the booksellers on Paternoster Row, who knew her by name and saved volumes they thought she might enjoy. With herself in the margins of books, in notebooks, in the running internal monologue that was as essential to her as breathing. At Ashton House, the conversation stopped. Lady Ashton did not want Eleanor's opinions. She wanted Eleanor's hands, to arrange flowers, to copy letters, to mend the hems of dresses that Beatrice had torn dancing. She wanted Eleanor's presence. A body in the chair beside her at assemblies, a figure in the background that signaled to the world that Lady Ashton was prosperous enough to maintain a companion. She wanted Eleanor's silence, the particular servile silence of a woman who has learned that speaking earns punishment and listening earns nothing, but nothing is preferable to pain. Beatrice, Lady Ashton's daughter, was not cruel in the way her mother was cruel. She was something worse. She was indifferent. She passed Eleanor in hallways without acknowledgment, the way one passes a piece of furniture that has always been there and will presumably always be there, and does not require attention. She borrowed Eleanor's tortoise-shell comb without asking and returned it without apology. She once, at a garden party, introduced Eleanor to a young officer by saying, "This is our companion. She does things." The officer had laughed. Eleanor had smiled, because smiling was what was expected, and excused herself, and walked to the far end of the garden, and stood behind the potting shed, and pressed her forehead against the brick wall, and squeezed her eyes shut, and dug her fingernails into her palms, until 4 small crescents of pain bloomed in her hands, like punctuation marks at the end of a sentence she could not say aloud. She did not cry. She had learned, as all women in her position learned, that tears were a luxury she could not afford. Tears required privacy, and privacy required a door that locked, and her door did not lock, and Lady Ashton had a habit of entering without knocking to verify that Eleanor was not idling. But she felt. She felt everything. That was the cruelty of it. Not that the silence had numbed her, but that it hadn't. She was not empty. She was full, brimming, overflowing with thoughts and arguments and observations and fury, all of it trapped behind her teeth like water behind a dam, building and building and building with nowhere to go. Until she found somewhere. This is the part of the story that changes everything, because this is the part where you learn that Eleanor Graves was not merely enduring her captivity. She was doing something about it. It began in December of 1839, 3 months after her arrival. She was lying in her narrow bed, unable to sleep, listening to the house settle around her. The tick of the hallway clock, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of wind in the lime trees. Her father's pocket watch was warm against her chest where she wore it on a ribbon, hidden beneath her nightgown. And in her mind, unbidden, the argument she had been composing all day, a response to an article she had read in the periodical left in the drawing-room, was assembling itself into sentences. The article had been about the poor laws. It had been written by a man who clearly had never been poor, and it had argued, with the confident ignorance of someone who has never missed a meal, that poverty was a moral failing rather than an economic condition. It had infuriated Eleanor in the specific electric way that bad reasoning infuriates someone who has been trained to recognize it. She got out of bed. She lit her candle stub, purchased with the single penny she had found on the floor of the assembly room, and kept hidden in the lining of her cloak. She opened one of her 14 notebooks, the only one that still had empty pages, and she wrote. She wrote for 3 hours. She wrote with the focused, furious intensity of a woman who has been silent for 3 months and has accumulated enough words to fill a cathedral. She wrote about the economics of poverty, about the legal structures that perpetuated it, about the hypocrisy of a society that blamed the poor for their poverty while constructing the very systems that made poverty inescapable. She wrote clearly. She wrote precisely. She wrote the way her father had taught her to write, with evidence, with logic, with the controlled heat of someone who is angry enough to burn, but disciplined enough to direct the flame. When she finished, she read it back. It was good. It was, she suspected, better than good. It was the kind of writing that would make a man in a leather armchair in a London club set down his brandy and actually think. She could not publish it. Women did not publish essays on political economy in 1843. They published novels, occasionally, under male pseudonyms. They published poetry, if it was sufficiently decorative. They did not publish arguments that took apart the foundations of English social policy with the precision of a watchmaker dismantling a clock. But they did publish under pen names. The next morning, Eleanor used the single sheet of writing paper that had come with her trunk, her last sheet, saved for an emergency, to copy the essay in a hand that was deliberately not her own. She signed it a Pemberton. She addressed it to the editor of the London Political Examiner, a periodical known for publishing provocative commentary. She sealed it with a drop of candle wax. Getting it to the post was the problem. Lady Ashton monitored correspondence. Every letter that entered or left the house passed through her hands. Eleanor could not simply walk it to the village post office. She was not permitted to leave the grounds without Lady Ashton's knowledge. But Eleanor had been watching the household for 3 months, and she had noticed something that Lady Ashton had not. The kitchen boy, a freckled 13-year-old named Piers, walked to the village every Wednesday morning to collect the household's flour delivery. He passed the post office on his way, and he had, on 2 occasions, smiled at Eleanor when she brought her tray to the kitchen, which in the emotional economy of Ashton House made him the closest thing she had to an ally. She waited for Wednesday. She caught Piers in the kitchen yard, pressed the letter into his hand along with the penny she had saved, and said, "Post this for me, and tell no one." Piers looked at the penny. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the letter. "Yes, miss," he said, and he meant it. 6 weeks later, Eleanor found a copy of the London Political Examiner in the drawing-room, left there by a visiting gentleman who had been too absorbed in the conversation to remember to take it with him. She waited until the room was empty. She opened it, and there, on page 7, under the heading, "On the True Economics of Poverty," was her essay. Her words, in print. The byline read, "A. Pemberton." Eleanor sat in the empty drawing-room and held the periodical in both hands and felt something she had not felt in 6 months. She felt real. The editor had included a note at the bottom. "The Examiner welcomes further correspondence from A. Pemberton, whose observations on the economic underpinnings of social policy are as incisive as any we have published this year." Eleanor read the note 3 times. Then she folded the periodical, returned it to the side table, and went upstairs to begin writing her second essay. Over the next 4 years, A. Pemberton published 14 essays in the London Political Examiner. They covered political economy, agricultural reform, the legal status of women, the ethics of industrial labor, and the structural failures of the English poor relief system. They were discussed in Parliament. They were quoted in other periodicals. They were debated at dinner tables across London by men who would have been appalled to discover that the author they were praising was a 28-year-old woman who slept in a servant's corridor and was not permitted to use her own name. The editor wrote to A. Pemberton after every publication. His letters were addressed to a post office box in the village, arranged through Piers, who was now 16 and had been promoted to under-footman, and who continued to serve as Eleanor's secret postmaster with a loyalty that Lady Ashton would never discover and could never have understood. The letters contained payment, small sums, 2 guineas per essay, sometimes 3. The money was Eleanor's lifeline. She saved it, hidden in the lining of her cloak, building a tiny, fragile reserve of independence, coin by coin, essay by essay, word by word. Or she would have if Lady Ashton had not found the letters. This happened in the spring of 1842, 1 year before the evening that would change everything. Eleanor had been careless. She had left a letter from the editor in her notebook, tucked between pages, and Lady Ashton, who had entered Eleanor's room to inspect it for unnecessary personal effects, a monthly ritual that Eleanor endured with the dead-eyed compliance of long practice, had found it. The confrontation was not dramatic. Lady Ashton did not shout. She did not strike. She stood in Eleanor's doorway with the letter in her hand and spoke in the voice she reserved for her most devastating pronouncements. The voice of a woman who had learned that cruelty delivered calmly is cruelty remembered longest. "You have been writing," Lady Ashton said. Yes. You have been publishing under a false name. Yes. You have been receiving money. Eleanor said nothing. Her silence was its own answer. Where is it? I have spent it, Eleanor lied. The money, 11 guineas, 4 years of careful accumulation, was still in her cloak. On candles. Lady Ashton studied her. The firelight from the hallway caught something in her expression that Eleanor had not seen before. Not anger, not contempt, but a flicker of something raw. Recognition. As though she had opened a drawer expecting to find linens and had instead found a mirror. The writing stops, Lady Ashton said. The correspondence stops. The money stops. If I discover that you have published so much as a single sentence without my knowledge, you will leave this house, and I will make certain that no household in England will take you. She paused, and then she said something she had never said before, something that came from a place deeper than strategy. Your mother was like you, clever, thought she was too good for the practical world. Married a man with books instead of money and died in a rented house because ideas do not keep you warm. I will not allow you to repeat her mistake. You will not write. You will not think yourself above this life. You will accept what you are. The words landed, and Eleanor understood something new about her aunt. Not forgiveness, understanding. Lady Ashton was not simply erasing Eleanor. She was erasing the version of herself she might have been, the clever girl who had never been allowed to use her cleverness for anything more significant than a guest list. Eleanor was the living proof that intelligence could survive poverty, could survive obscurity, could survive anything. And Lady Ashton, who had sacrificed her own intelligence on the altar of social advancement, found that proof unbearable. Your notebooks will be collected every Sunday evening and inspected, Lady Ashton continued, her voice restored to its usual cold precision. Your correspondence will pass through my hands, and you will not write a single word that I have not approved. Is that understood? Yes, Lady Ashton. The notebooks were collected that evening. All 14 of them. 4 years of writing, of thinking, of being alive on the page when she was dead everywhere else. Lady Ashton carried them downstairs and placed them in her study in a locked drawer with the key on the ring that never left her waist. Eleanor stood in her empty room and looked at the space where the notebooks had been. A gap on the small shelf beside her bed, the wood slightly lighter where they had rested, a rectangle of unfaded paint that marked their absence like a scar. And she pressed her back against the wall and slid down until she was sitting on the cold floor with her knees drawn up and her arms wrapped around them and her face buried in the rough wool of her skirt. She shook. She did not cry. She still could not cry, had not cried since her father died, as though the tears had dried up at the source and left only this dry, heaving, soundless convulsion that racked her body like a cough that produces nothing. She pressed her mouth against her knee to keep the sound in. She bit the fabric until her jaw ached. She rocked slightly, the motion of a child comforting itself, and she stayed on that floor for a long time until the shaking passed, and what remained was not grief but something harder. Rage. Not the helpless, suffocating rage of someone who has no options. The other kind, the kind that calculates, the kind that plans, the kind that a woman develops when she has spent 4 years learning the exact dimensions of her cage and has begun, quietly, methodically, to test the bars. She was not done writing. She would never be done writing. Lady Ashton could take her notebooks, but she could not take her mind, and a woman with a mind like Eleanor's needed only a surface and a tool. The margins of books, the inside covers of hymnals, the backs of recipes that the cook discarded. Eleanor found surfaces, and she wrote on them in handwriting so small it required a magnifying glass to read, in the dark, by feel, with the stub of a pencil she had taken from the schoolroom. Her 15th essay was composed entirely in the margins of a volume of Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. She copied it onto a sheet of paper stolen from Lady Ashton's writing desk, sealed it with wax from a candle end, and gave it to Piers. It was published in March of 1843. A. Pemberton was back, and among the readers of that 15th essay was a man who had been looking for A. Pemberton for 2 years, with the obsessive, methodical intensity of someone who has been trained to find things and who does not stop until he has found them. His name was Sebastian Hale. He was the Duke of Ashworth. And he was about to walk into Lady Ashton's dining room and meet the woman he had been searching for, without having the faintest idea that she was the one person in the room who was not permitted to speak. Now, I need to tell you about Sebastian Hale, because understanding him is essential to understanding what happens next, and because the man the world saw, the Duke, the politician, the feared debater with the cold gray eyes and the reputation for destroying his opponents with a precision that bordered on surgical, was not the man who existed in the privacy of his own mind. The world saw power. Sebastian experienced isolation. He was 35 years old. He had been the Duke of Ashworth since the age of 22, when his father had collapsed at the breakfast table and died with a piece of toast in his hand and the morning edition of the Times unopened beside his plate. The old Duke had never been kind. He had been efficient, a man who administered his family the way a foreman administers a factory, with schedules and expectations and performance reviews conducted over dinner with the emotional warmth of an audit. Sebastian had been the wrong kind of son. He read too much. He preferred the library to the hunting field. He asked questions at dinner that his father found embarrassing. Questions about politics, about ethics, about why the tenants' cottages had leaking roofs when the stables had been rethatched twice in a decade. His father had called him soft. His mother, who loved him in the helpless, constrained way that duchesses loved their children, from across a nursery staffed by professionals, had called him sensitive, which was the polite version of the same word. The 6th Duke of Ashworth had inherited £42,000 a year, 3 estates, 4,000 acres, a seat in the House of Lords, and the expectation that he would marry well, produce an heir, and continue the unbroken chain of Hale Dukes that stretched back to the Restoration. He had fulfilled the first expectation within 2 years. Lady Charlotte Vane, daughter of the Marquis of Stenton, beautiful, accomplished, connected. The match was considered one of the great triumphs of the 1832 season. Mothers of less fortunate daughters wept into their fans. Society columnists praised the union as though they had personally arranged it. What society did not know, and what Sebastian would carry like a stone in his chest for the rest of his life, was that Charlotte Vane had not married Sebastian Hale. She had married the Duke of Ashworth. The distinction is everything. Charlotte wanted the title. She wanted Ashworth Park, with its 600 rooms and its capability brown gardens, and its position at the very summit of the English aristocracy. She wanted the carriages and the jewels and the London townhouse and the ability to walk into any room in England and know that she outranked every woman in it. What she did not want was Sebastian. She found him dull. He read too much. He cared about politics when he should have cared about parties. He spent hours in his study writing speeches when he should have been entertaining. He was, in her words, spoken to a friend at a house party, in a voice carefully calibrated to carry just far enough for Sebastian to overhear from the adjacent room. The most tedious man in England, but at least he comes with a coronet. He had been standing behind a half-open door. He heard every word. He pressed his hand flat against the door-frame and held his breath, and waited until the laughter faded, and then he went to his study and sat at his desk and stared at the wall for an hour without moving. He did not confront her. He did not weep. He simply felt something inside him close, like a book being shut, like a gate being locked. The quiet, permanent closure of a man who has been told he is not enough by the person who promised to love him. The marriage lasted 4 years. Charlotte's affair with Lord Denton Fairfax was conducted with such theatrical indiscretion that even the most generous interpretation could not describe it as a secret. She was seen with him at the opera. She danced with him 3 times at the Marchioness of Pembroke's ball. She left a letter on her dressing table which her lady's maid cleaned every morning, that contained endearments so explicit that the maid brought it directly to the housekeeper, who brought it to the butler, who brought it to Sebastian. He confronted Charlotte. She laughed. "What did you expect?" she said. "You are a duke. You are not a husband. Those are different things." Charlotte died 6 months later. A riding accident. She was galloping across the estate with Fairfax, took offense badly, and was thrown. She broke her neck. She was 27 years old. Sebastian mourned her publicly, as duty required. Privately, he mourned something else, the version of himself that had believed, however briefly, that he could be loved for what he was rather than for what he possessed. For the next 7 years he refused to marry again. His solicitors pressed him. His political allies pressed him. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, pressed him with the genteel relentlessness of a woman who had produced only 1 son and needed a grandson. Sebastian refused them all. He turned his attention to 2 things: Parliament and reading. In Parliament he was devastating. His speeches were precise, evidenced, and delivered with a controlled intensity that made his opponents feel as though their arguments were being disassembled in front of them. He championed factory reform, education funding, and the revision of the poor laws. He was not popular. He was effective, which in politics is better and more dangerous. In reading, he was voracious. He read everything: philosophy, political economy, natural science, history, agricultural theory. He corresponded with writers and thinkers across England and Europe. He had opinions, and unlike most men of his station, those opinions were informed, considered, and subject to revision when better evidence was presented, which is how he discovered a Pemberton. The first essay, On the True Economics of Poverty, arrived on his desk in January of 1840, clipped from the London Political Examiner by his secretary, who had been instructed to flag anything of substance in the periodicals. Sebastian read it once, quickly. Then he read it again, slowly. Then he set it down and stared at the wall for a full minute. "Who is this?" he asked his secretary. "Unknown, Your Grace. The editor says the author corresponds through a post-office box in Hertfordshire. No one has met him." "Find out." The secretary tried. He contacted the editor, who refused to reveal the author's identity. He visited the post office in Hertfordshire, where the postmaster, a discreet and principled man, confirmed only that a box was registered to A. Pemberton and that correspondence was collected regularly by a young man who gave no name and accepted no questions. The trail ended. A. Pemberton remained invisible. Sebastian read every subsequent essay the moment it was published. He read them the way a musician listens to another musician, not merely for content but for technique. The writing was extraordinary. It had a quality that Sebastian had encountered only in the very best minds, the ability to see familiar problems from entirely unfamiliar angles and to articulate solutions that were simultaneously radical and obvious. But it was more than skill. There was something in the writing that felt personal, a heat beneath the precision, a fury beneath the logic. Whoever a Pemberton was, they were not writing from the comfortable distance of an armchair philosopher. They were writing from somewhere closer to the subject, somewhere that hurt. Sebastian began writing letters to A. Pemberton. Not through the editor. That felt too formal. He wrote to the post office box in Hertfordshire, addressed simply to A. Pemberton, knowing that the odds of receiving a reply were slim and not caring. The first letter was 3 pages long. It was the most honest thing Sebastian had written to anyone in years. He told A. Pemberton that the essay on industrial labor had changed his position on factory regulation. He asked questions. He offered counter-arguments. He wrote not as a duke addressing a subject, but as a mind addressing an equal. 6 weeks later, a reply arrived. 1 page. Unsigned except for the familiar A. Pemberton at the bottom. The handwriting was small, careful, and furiously intelligent. Every sentence contained enough ideas for a paragraph, compressed with the discipline of someone who was accustomed to working with limited paper. The reply did not agree with him. It corrected him on 2 points of fact, challenged him on 3 points of logic, and concluded with a sentence that Sebastian would carry in his memory for the rest of his life. You argue as though reform is a gift to be bestowed by the powerful upon the powerless. It is not. It is a debt owed. And debts, Your Grace, for I am quite certain from the quality of the paper that you are someone of consequence, do not diminish because the creditor is polite about the collection. Your Grace. The writer knew, or suspected, that they were corresponding with someone powerful, and they did not care. They did not defer, did not flatter, did not soften their arguments to accommodate his station. Sebastian felt something he had not felt since Charlotte's death. He felt seen. Over the next 2 years they exchanged 31 letters. The correspondence was, for Sebastian, the most important intellectual relationship of his life. A. Pemberton was brilliant, acerbic, occasionally funny, and always honest. They debated agricultural policy, the ethics of empire, the education of women, and whether Bentham or Mill offered the better foundation for social reform. They disagreed passionately and frequently. Neither of them ever conceded a point without evidence. And through it all, A. Pemberton remained invisible. No name, no face, no clue except the Hertfordshire postmark and the small, precise handwriting that Sebastian had studied so often he could recognize it across a room. He tried to find them, quietly, carefully, without alerting the press or the gossip networks that followed his every movement. He hired a discreet inquiry agent. The agent traced the post office box to the village of Hartfield. He traced the collections to a young man, possibly a servant, who comes every Wednesday. He traced the young man to the vicinity of a house called Ashton House, and there the trail stopped, because the agent, who was thorough but not creative, did not think to look beyond the obvious. He was searching for a man, a gentleman scholar, a political thinker. He was not searching for a woman who was not permitted to use her own name. The agent's report sat on Sebastian's desk in April of 1843. It contained one useful detail: the name of the household near the post office box, Ashton House, Lady Vivian Ashton, a widow of independent means with 1 daughter. Sebastian needed an invitation to that house. Getting it was simple. A duke does not ask for invitations. He indicates willingness, and the invitations materialize. Sebastian mentioned to an acquaintance in London that he was considering a visit to Hertfordshire. The acquaintance mentioned it to his wife. The wife mentioned it to Lady Ashton, who nearly fainted with excitement and dispatched an invitation to Ashworth Park within the hour. A duke, in her dining room, the social coup of a lifetime. She did not know that the duke was coming for a ghost, and she certainly did not know that the ghost was the woman she had silenced 4 years ago and placed at the far end of the table in a dress the color of nothing. The dinner was arranged for the second Tuesday in April. Lady Ashton prepared for it with the intensity of a general planning a campaign. The menu was revised 7 times. The silver was polished until it could be used as a mirror. Beatrice was fitted for a new gown, pale blue with lace at the sleeves that had cost more than Eleanor's annual expenditure on candles. Lady Ashton herself wore emerald green and her late husband's diamond brooch, deployed like artillery. Eleanor was given instructions. "You will sit at the end of the table," Lady Ashton said. "You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not draw attention. If the Duke addresses you, which he will not, but if he does, you will reply briefly and redirect the conversation to Beatrice. Is that clear?" "Yes, Lady Ashton. And for God's sake, do not say anything clever. Men do not like clever women. They like agreeable ones." Eleanor put on her dishwater-colored dress and pinned her hair with the tortoise-shell comb. The one indulgence Lady Ashton had not taken from her, perhaps because it was too plain to be worth confiscating, and went downstairs to take her place at the far end of the table, behind the candelabra, in the shadows, where she belonged. The Duke of Ashworth arrived at 7 o'clock. Eleanor heard him before she saw him. A voice in the entrance hall, deep and measured, exchanging pleasantries with Lady Ashton in the practised tone of a man who had attended 10,000 social events and retained the ability to be polite at all of them. Then he entered the dining room, and Eleanor looked at him, and her first thought was, "He does not want to be here." She recognized the expression because she wore it herself every day, the careful social mask, the controlled blankness that concealed an active, restless mind scanning the room for something worth its attention. He was tall, broad-shouldered but lean, as though he spent more time at a desk than on a horse. His face was angular, a strong jaw, a straight nose, gray eyes set beneath brows that had a permanent furrow of concentration, as though he was always in the middle of a thought. His hair was dark and slightly disordered in a way that suggested he had run his hand through it at least once since leaving his carriage. And there, on his right cuff, almost invisible against the dark fabric of his coat, a small smudge of ink. Eleanor noticed the ink the way a sailor notices the wind. Automatically, instinctively, because ink was the medium of her secret life, and she recognized it the way she recognized her own reflection. He was a writer, or at least a man who spent enough time with a pen to forget to check his cuffs. Dinner proceeded as Lady Ashton had orchestrated. The soup was excellent. The conversation was not. Lady Ashton steered every topic toward Beatrice's accomplishments. Her pianoforte playing, her watercolors, her charitable visits to the village poor, a catalogue of feminine virtues delivered with the relentless efficiency of a saleswoman displaying merchandise. Beatrice smiled and blushed on cue. She was not stupid. Eleanor had always known that, but she was thoroughly, comprehensively trained. Every response was calibrated to charm without threatening. Every opinion was soft enough to be inoffensive and vague enough to be adaptable. The Duke listened. He nodded at appropriate intervals. He complimented the soup. He asked Beatrice about her watercolors with the kind, patient attention of a man who is performing a social duty and performing it well. But Eleanor, who had spent 4 years studying the difference between genuine attention and performative courtesy, saw that his eyes were moving, not resting on Beatrice, not fixed on Lady Ashton, moving, scanning the table, the room, the faces, searching. He was looking for someone. The moment came during the fish course. The visiting vicar, a Mr. Humphreys, was expounding on the economic benefits of the new railway connection to the northern counties. He quoted a statistic, the volume of goods transported by rail versus canal in the previous year, and got it wrong. Not egregiously wrong, off by about 15%. A minor error that most people would not have noticed and fewer would have corrected. Eleanor noticed. She did not intend to speak. She had been silent for 4 years. She was practiced at silence the way a professional musician is practiced at their instrument. She could maintain it through anything, through errors, through injustices, through conversations so tedious they constituted a form of torture. But the number was wrong, and the wrongness of it itched at her the way a splinter itches under the skin, because her father had taught her that facts matter, that precision matters, that allowing an error to pass uncorrected is a small betrayal of the truth. And truth was the only thing Eleanor had left that no one had managed to take from her. "It was 412,000 tons," she said. The table went silent. Eleanor felt the silence land on her like a physical weight. Lady Ashton's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Beatrice's eyes widened. The vicar turned, baffled, to look at the woman at the end of the table whom he had not previously registered as a person capable of speech. "I beg your pardon?" Mr. Humphreys said. "The tonnage." Eleanor's voice was quiet but steady. "You cited 340,000. The figure published in the Railway Commissioner's report last autumn was 412,000. The discrepancy is significant because it represents the capacity of the Manchester to Liverpool corridor specifically, which accounts for nearly a third of total freight volume." The silence deepened. Lady Ashton's expression had passed through surprise and arrived at fury, the thin-lipped, white-knuckled fury of a woman watching her most carefully controlled asset malfunction in public. And then Sebastian Hale, the Duke of Ashworth, who had been scanning the room for the mind he had been corresponding with for 2 years, turned in his chair and looked at the woman at the end of the table with an expression that Eleanor had never seen directed at her before. Interest. Not the polite, empty interest of social convention. The real thing. The sharp, focused, entirely sincere interest of a man who has just heard something that surprised him and who is recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the room he was sitting in. "You have read the Railway Commissioner's report?" he asked. Eleanor hesitated. She could feel Lady Ashton's gaze like a blade at her throat. "I read widely, Your Grace." "Clearly?" A pause. "And your assessment of the Commissioner's methodology?" "The sampling was inconsistent across the northern corridors." It was a test. Eleanor recognized it instantly, the way a fencer recognizes a parry. He was not making conversation. He was probing, trying to determine whether her correction had been a lucky recollection or the product of genuine understanding. She should have deflected. She should have said something vague and modest and let the conversation return to Beatrice's watercolors. She should have done what Lady Ashton's expression was silently, furiously commanding her to do: disappear. Instead, she answered, "The methodology was flawed in the same way that most government reports on industrial capacity are flawed," she said. "The data was collected from operators who had a financial incentive to underreport volume. The Commissioner acknowledged this in a footnote on page 47, which most readers skip, and adjusted the figures upward by 8%. Even with the adjustment, the true numbers are likely higher." The Duke stared at her. "Page 47, he repeated. Footnote. 12, Eleanor confirmed. It is a small footnote, but the implications are considerable. A beat of silence. Then something happened that Eleanor had never seen at a dinner table. The Duke of Ashworth smiled, not a social smile, not the careful, controlled expression he had been wearing all evening, a real smile, sudden and unguarded, that transformed his angular face into something approaching warmth. "Miss," he began, and then stopped because he did not know her name, because no one had introduced her, because she had been placed at the end of the table specifically so that she would not require introduction. He turned to Lady Ashton. "Forgive me. I do not believe I have been introduced to this lady." Lady Ashton's smile was a masterwork of controlled hostility. "This is my companion," she said. The word landed with emphasis. "She assists with household matters." "Your companion," the Duke repeated. "And her name?" "She is my companion." The repetition was deliberate. Eleanor felt it like a door slamming shut, but the Duke did not accept it. He turned back to Eleanor with those grey eyes that missed nothing, and he asked the question that would change everything. "What is your name?" And Eleanor, who had not spoken her own name in 4 years, opened her mouth and said it. "Eleanor. Eleanor Graves." I want to pause here for a moment because I think some of you listening know this feeling. Not this exact feeling, not this story exactly, but the shape of it. The experience of being in a room where no one asks your name, where no one thinks you are worth the asking, and then someone does. One person, and the sound of your own name in the air, spoken to someone who actually wants to hear it, is so startling, so unfamiliar, so painfully beautiful that you cannot quite believe it is real. If you know that feeling, tell me in the comments. I want to hear about it. Now, let me tell you what happened next, because what happened next is where the story turns. What happened after dinner was, from Lady Ashton's perspective, a catastrophe of the highest order. The Duke of Ashworth did not retire to the drawing-room for coffee. He did not engage Beatrice in conversation about her watercolors. He did not compliment the furnishings or praise the port, or do any of the things that an extremely eligible duke was supposed to do when presented with an extremely eligible young woman in an extremely well-appointed drawing-room. He asked to see the library. "I noticed several volumes on my way to the dining-room," he said, addressing Lady Ashton with the pleasant, implacable courtesy of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted without needing to insist. "I would very much enjoy a moment to examine them." Lady Ashton could not refuse a duke access to her library. She conducted him there herself, chattering about the provenance of the furniture and the age of the house and the quality of the plasterwork on the ceiling, while Sebastian walked the shelves with the unhurried patience of a man who reads the way other men breathe. He was not looking at the books. He was looking at the margins. Eleanor did not know this. She was upstairs, sitting on her bed, waiting for the punishment she knew was coming. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight against the wall, listening to the house the way a rabbit listens to a field, for the sound of approaching footsteps, for the creak of a floorboard that meant Lady Ashton was coming. She could reconstruct her aunt's fury with perfect accuracy, the thin-lipped silence, the slow, deliberate recitation of Eleanor's crimes, the threat of dismissal that hung over every conversation like a blade. She did not regret what she had said. She had spoken a fact. Facts were not crimes. And the Duke had asked her name, and she had answered, and the sound of it, Eleanor, was still reverberating inside her chest like the last note of a bell. But she also understood, with the cold clarity that 4 years of captivity had taught her, that she had made herself visible. And visibility in this house was dangerous. What she did not know, could not have known, was what was happening in the library below. Sebastian Hale was standing in front of a shelf of history volumes, his finger tracing the spine of a particular book, when he stopped. He pulled the book from the shelf. It was a volume of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. He opened it to a random page. In the margin, in handwriting so small it was almost invisible, someone had written a note, a critique of Smith's labor theory of value, compressed into 3 lines, with a reference to a French economist that Sebastian had only encountered in one other place. In a letter from a Pemberton. His hands went still. He turned to another page, another marginal note. This one was longer, a counter-argument to Smith's position on trade, written with the compressed, furious precision that Sebastian would have recognized anywhere. He had read 31 letters in that handwriting. He had studied it the way a scholar studies a primary text. He knew its rhythms, its habits, the way it compressed vowels and elongated consonants, the particular slant of the T crosses, and the distinctive loop of the GE. This was A. Pemberton's handwriting. A. Pemberton had written in the margins of this book. A. Pemberton was in this house. Sebastian closed the book. He replaced it on the shelf. He pulled down another volume, Malthus, and opened it. More marginalia, the same hand, the same compressed, brilliant, furious intelligence. He went through 6 more volumes. Everyone had notes. Everyone was in the same handwriting. And the content was consistent with the mind he had been corresponding with for 2 years. The same arguments, the same references, the same distinctive blend of evidence and moral passion. A. Pemberton lived in this house. A. Pemberton had access to this library. A. Pemberton wrote in the margins because they had no paper of their own. And then Sebastian thought about the woman at the end of the dinner table. The woman in the colorless dress. The woman who had corrected a railway statistic from memory and cited a footnote by number. The woman whose name Lady Ashton had refused to speak. The woman who had said, in a voice that cracked on the second syllable, "Eleanor Graves." The realization arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a key turning in a lock, quiet, precise, and irreversible. A. Pemberton was not a man. A. Pemberton was not a gentleman scholar. A. Pemberton was not any of the things that Sebastian and his inquiry agent and the entire intellectual establishment of London had assumed. A. Pemberton was a woman named Eleanor Graves, who slept in a servants' corridor and was not permitted to use her own name, and who had, despite every obstacle that an unjust world could construct, produced the most brilliant political writing in England. Sebastian Hale, the 6th Duke of Ashworth, the most feared debater in Parliament, the man whose composure had survived 4 years of marital humiliation and 7 years of aristocratic isolation without cracking, stood in Lady Ashton's library and pressed his hand against the bookshelf and closed his eyes. And he felt something he had not felt since he read that first essay in January of 1840. He felt everything. He did not confront Lady Ashton that evening. He did not reveal his discovery. He did not do anything rash or dramatic or satisfying in the way that stories promise, but life rarely delivers. Instead, he did what Sebastian Hale always did when faced with a problem of extraordinary complexity and extraordinary importance. He planned. The planning took 3 days. During those 3 days, Sebastian did the following things. He had his solicitor pull the public records on Lady Vivian Ashton, her late husband's, will, her property holdings, her financial accounts. He had his inquiry agent investigate the circumstances of Eleanor's arrival at Ashton House, the death of Edmund Graves, the debts, the disposition of his estate. He had his secretary obtain every issue of the London Political Examiner from the past 4 years and compile a complete archive of a Pemberton's essays, and he sat in his study and waited for the solicitor's report. It arrived on the third day. Sebastian read it at his desk. What he found made him go very still. The facts were these. Edmund Graves had owed Lady Ashton £200 at the time of his death. A loan made 4 years earlier, when Mrs. Graves was dying and Edmund needed money for physicians. The loan was secured by a promissory note that Lady Ashton held. £200. This was the debt that had delivered Eleanor into Lady Ashton's house, the debt that justified 4 years of unpaid labor, 4 years of erasure, 4 years of a woman being stripped of her name and her work and her identity. Except for one detail. The debt had been repaid in full 2 years ago. Edmund Graves's estate, when it was finally settled by the courts, had produced just enough to cover his outstanding obligations. His creditors were paid, including Lady Ashton, who received her £200 in March of 1841. Lady Ashton had never told Eleanor. For 2 years, Eleanor had been living under the belief that she owed a debt that no longer existed, performing unpaid labor for a woman who had no legal claim on her services, submitting to the erasure of her identity because she believed she had no choice. She had a choice. She had had a choice for 2 years. Lady Ashton had simply never given it to her. Sebastian set the report down on his desk. He placed both hands flat on the mahogany surface. He breathed once, twice, 3 times, with the measured control of a man who knows that the thing building inside his chest is too large and too dangerous to release without preparation. Then he stood, picked up the crystal decanter from the sideboard, and hurled it against the study wall. It shattered with a sound like a cannon shot. Brandy exploded across the plaster and ran down the wallpaper in amber streaks. Glass fragments scattered across the carpet like shrapnel. The impact left a dent in the wall that his valet would later describe to the housekeeper as the kind of mark that takes real fury to make. Sebastian stood in the center of his study, breathing hard, his chest heaving, his right hand still extended from the throw. His grey eyes, which the entire House of Lords knew as the coldest and most controlled eyes in English politics, were blazing. Not with anger, with something beyond anger. The particular white-hot, incandescent rage of a good man who has just discovered that a woman he cares about has been held in bondage by a lie, and that the lie is not complicated, not subtle, not the kind of deception that requires intelligence to unravel. It is simply cruelty. Ordinary, lazy, venal cruelty. The cruelty of someone who kept a human being in a cage because opening the door was less convenient than leaving it shut. The study door opened. Harrison, his valet, looked at the shattered decanter, the brandy running down the wall, and the Duke standing in the middle of the room, with an expression that Harrison had never seen in 12 years of service and hoped never to see again. "Your Grace?" Harrison said carefully. Sebastian closed his eyes. He breathed. He brought his hands to his sides. He unclenched his jaw. The volcano receded, not gone, not extinguished, but deliberately, methodically banked, the fire directed inward where it would do what fire does best. It would forge. "Get me the writing box," Sebastian said. His voice was level, terrifyingly level. "And a new decanter, and then leave me. I will be here for some time." He sat down at his desk. He opened the writing box. He pulled out a clean sheet of paper, and then Sebastian Hale, the Duke of Ashworth, began to write the most important letter of his life, not to Parliament, not to a political ally, not to any of the powerful men who had built their careers on his words. He wrote to Eleanor. "Miss Graves, I have 3 things to tell you. First, Your debt to Lady Ashton was repaid in full in March of 1841. She did not inform you. The documentation is enclosed. Second, the London Political Examiner owes A. Pemberton payment for essays 12 through 15, which were published after Lady Ashton intercepted your correspondence with the editor. I have contacted the editor on your behalf. The payments, 8 guineas, will be held at the Hartfield post office in your name. Third, I was wrong in our last encounter. I asked your name, and I was glad to hear it, and I am writing to tell you the rest. I have been corresponding with a writer called a Pemberton for 2 years. I believe that writer is you. If I am wrong, you may discard this letter and think no more of it. If I am right, then I owe you a debt that no title or fortune can adequately repay, because your writing has changed how I think, and there is no greater gift one mind can give another. I have questions. I suspect you have answers. I also suspect that the circumstances of your current situation make it difficult, perhaps dangerous, for you to receive correspondence. If you are willing to meet me, I will be at the old church in Hartfield Village on Saturday morning at 10 o'clock. I will come alone. I will bring no servants, no agents, no one who might compromise your privacy. You do not owe me this meeting. You owe me nothing. But I am asking for it, not as a duke, but as a man who has spent 2 years talking to a mind he admires, and who would very much like to see the face that belongs to it. S. Hale. He sealed the letter. He addressed it to Miss Eleanor Graves, care of Ashton House, and then he did something that revealed the depth of his understanding of Eleanor's situation. He did not post it. He gave it to Piers. How he found Piers is a story in itself. Sebastian's inquiry agent had identified the under-footman as the person who collected A. Pemberton's post. Sebastian had come to the village, found Piers at the coaching inn on his half-day, and sat down across from him with the direct, undecorated manner of a man who does not have time for pretense. "You carry letters for Miss Graves," Sebastian said. Piers, who was 16 and had the survival instincts of someone raised in service, went pale. "I don't know what you mean, sir. I am not here to cause trouble for you or for her. I am here because I have been corresponding with her for 2 years, and I need to get a letter to her without Lady Ashton's knowledge." Piers stared. You're the one who writes to her? About the politics and such?" "Yes." "She reads your letters," Piers said, and then, with a loyalty that Sebastian would remember for the rest of his life, "She reads them over and over. They're the only thing in that house that makes her smile." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his gray eyes. Not the fury of the shattered decanter, but something softer, something that hurt more. "Will you take this to her?" he said. Piers took the letter. "She'll want to know if you're safe, if this is a trick." "Tell her it is not a trick. Tell her the man who wrote to her about Bentham and Mill is the same man who asked her name at dinner, and who would very much like to hear her say it again." Eleanor received the letter at 6 o'clock on Thursday morning, slipped under her door by Piers, who knocked twice, their signal, and disappeared before she could open it. She read it standing up, because sitting down felt insufficient for what the letter contained. She read it twice. The first time for content, the second time for the enclosed documentation, the solicitor's confirmation that her debt had been repaid, that Lady Ashton had no legal claim on her, that she had been free for 2 years without knowing it. Free. The word sat in her chest like a stone. For 2 years. She had been free for 2 years, and she had not known. She had mended Lady Ashton's hems, and organized Lady Ashton's correspondence, and stood in Lady Ashton's shadow at assemblies, and answered to "companion" and surrendered her notebooks and bitten her tongue until it bled. All of it, for a debt that no longer existed. She sat on her bed. She pressed the letter against her chest. She stared at the wall, and then she processed the rest. The Duke of Ashworth was S. Hale. S. Hale was the man who had been writing to her for 2 years, the man whose letters she kept in the lining of her cloak alongside her 11 guineas, the man who had debated Bentham and Mill with her, who had conceded points when she was right, who had pushed back when she was wrong, who had treated her like an intellectual equal in a world that did not believe women could be intellectual at all. He had found her. He knew she was A. Pemberton. He wanted to meet. And he had said, the line that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, "There is no greater gift one mind can give another. Not beauty, not compliance, not the performance of femininity that Lady Ashton valued and Beatrice embodied. A mind. He valued her mind. Eleanor Graves, who had not cried in 4 years, who had held herself together through the loss of her father and the loss of her name and the loss of her notebooks and every daily degradation that Lady Ashton's house could deliver. Eleanor Graves pressed her face into her pillow and broke, not quietly, not with dignity, not the way women in stories cry, a single tear tracking down a porcelain cheek. She cried the way a dam breaks, ugly, heaving, gasping, 4 years of unshed tears released, pressed into the pillow to muffle because the walls were thin and the servants' corridor was quiet. And even now, even in this moment of total collapse, the trained reflex of silence held. She cried for her father, who had died holding her hand and saying her name. She cried for her mother, whose face she could no longer fully remember. She cried for the 4 years she had spent being no one, and for the 2 years she had been free without knowing it, and for all the mornings she had checked the mirror and seen nothing looking back, because she had been told so many times that she was nothing that she had started to believe it. And she cried because a man she had never met, a man who knew her only through her words, had read those words and called them a gift. And the crying was not grief. It was something closer to thawing, the painful, necessary, agonizing process of a frozen thing returning to life. It lasted 20 minutes. When it stopped, Eleanor lay on her side in her narrow bed, her face swollen, her pillow soaked, her body hollow and shaking, and, for the first time in 4 years, absolutely, fundamentally clear. She got up. She washed her face with cold water from the basin. She straightened her back. She dried her eyes. Then she began to plan. Getting out of the house on Saturday morning required the kind of strategic deception that Eleanor had been practicing for 4 years. Lady Ashton attended morning calls on Saturdays, accompanied by Beatrice. Eleanor was typically left at the house with instructions to organize the week's correspondence and inventory the linen. At 9:30, Eleanor put on her cloak, the one with 11 guineas and 31 letters hidden in the lining, and walked out the kitchen door. She had not walked to the village alone in 4 years. The path was familiar. Down the Lime Tree Avenue, through the gate, along the lane past the mill, to the high street with its baker and draper and coaching inn. Every step felt like a small rebellion. Every breath of air that did not carry the scent of Lady Ashton's parlour felt like freedom. The old church of St. Michael's sat at the southern end of the village, surrounded by yew trees and headstones that leaned at angles that suggested they were tired of standing. The door was open. The interior was cool, dim, and empty, except for the man standing by the west window with his hands behind his back and his face turned toward the light. He heard her enter. He turned. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. He was wearing a plain dark coat, Not the formal evening dress of the dinner party, but the clothing of a man who had made an effort to appear approachable. The ink smudge was on his left cuff this time. His hair was disordered in the same way as before, and his gray eyes held an expression that Eleanor recognized from his letters, the look of a man who is thinking very carefully before he speaks, because he knows that what he says next matters. "Miss Graves," he said, "Your Grace." A pause. Then, with a directness that startled her, "You are A. Pemberton." It was not a question, but it required an answer. Yes. He exhaled. It was a sound that contained more relief than Eleanor had expected. The sound of a man who had been carrying a hypothesis and had just received confirmation, and who understands that confirmation is a door that only opens one way. "Your essay on the poor laws," he said, "changed how I voted in committee. Your essay on women's legal status changed how I thought about property reform. Your essay on agricultural labor—" He stopped, shook his head. "Your essay on agricultural labor changed everything." "It was my strongest piece," Eleanor said, and was surprised to hear herself sound not modest, but factual, as though they were already in the middle of a conversation that had been going on for 2 years, which, in a sense, they were. "It was brilliant," Sebastian said, "but it was also angry, and anger like that does not come from theory. It comes from experience." Eleanor said nothing. "How long has Lady Ashton been—" He stopped, tried again. "What has she done to you?" The question was asked without pity. It was asked with the same precision he brought to his parliamentary speeches, not as a display of sympathy, but as a fact-finding exercise. He wanted data, because data was what he used to solve problems, and he had decided, Eleanor realized, that she was a problem he intended to solve. "You do not know me well enough to ask that," she said. "I have been reading your thoughts for 2 years. I know you better than anyone." "You know my arguments. That is not the same as knowing me." He accepted the correction with a slight inclination of his head. "You are right. I apologize." Eleanor studied him. This was the Duke of Ashworth, the most feared man in Parliament, the most eligible bachelor in England, the man whose composure was legendary, and he was standing in a village church, apologizing to a woman in a second-hand cloak, because she had told him he was overstepping. "Ask me something smaller," she said. He thought about it. "Do you actually believe that Bentham offers a superior framework to Mill, or were you arguing the position in your last letter to provoke me?" Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest. "Both," she said. "Bentham's calculus has structural flaws, but Mill's sentimentalism makes it functionally useless as a policy instrument. I was provoking you because you had not addressed the structural flaws in your previous 3 letters, and I suspected you were avoiding them." "I was avoiding them? I know. Why? Because your argument was better than mine, and I was not yet prepared to concede." "And now?" "I concede," he said. "On Bentham, on Mill, and on the matter of whether this conversation is the most extraordinary thing that has happened to me in 7 years, which it is, and I have not even sat down yet." Eleanor did not smile. She was not ready to smile at a duke who had walked into her life 48 hours ago, regardless of how many letters they had exchanged. But something in her expression shifted, a softening, the smallest, most cautious lowering of a guard that had been raised for 4 years. "There are pews," she said. "You may sit." They talked for 3 hours. They talked about Bentham and Mill. They talked about the Railway Commissioner's report and the flawed methodology on page 47. They talked about Eleanor's father, who had taught her Latin and Greek, and the difference between an argument and an opinion, and about Sebastian's father, who had taught him nothing except how to inherit things and died before anyone thought to teach him how to live with them. They talked about Charlotte. Sebastian told her the truth, not the society version, not the sanitized eulogy, but the real, ugly, humiliating truth about a woman who had married his title and despised his person. He told her about the letter on the dressing table. He told her about the riding accident and the black suit and the 7 years of refusing to trust anyone. He did not know why he told her. He had never spoken about Charlotte to anyone, but there was something about Eleanor's silence, not the trained, obedient silence of Ashton House, but the deep, attentive silence of a person who knows how to listen because they understand the value of words, that made honesty feel not only possible, but necessary. "She said I was the most tedious man in England," he said. "She said it at a house party. She intended for me to hear it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She was wrong." "You have known me for 3 hours?" "I have known your mind for 2 years," Eleanor said. "A mind that concedes when it is wrong, that asks questions instead of making pronouncements, that reads footnotes on page 47. That mind is many things, Your Grace. Tedious is not one of them." Sebastian looked at her. The morning light through the church window caught the angle of her jaw, the quiet determination of her mouth, the brown eyes that held an intelligence so fierce it was almost physical. "Sebastian," he said, "I beg your pardon?" "My name. You called me Your Grace. My name is Sebastian." A beat. "I know your name," Eleanor said. "I have known it for 2 years. I looked it up after your second letter because the quality of the paper suggested wealth and the quality of the arguments suggested education, and the combination in 1843 narrows the field considerably." "You knew." "I knew." "And you continued to write to me as though I were an ordinary man?" "You wrote to me as though I were an ordinary man," Eleanor said. "It seemed only fair to return the courtesy." Sebastian laughed. It was a sound that surprised both of them, low, genuine, slightly rough, as though it had not been used in a long time and had needed oiling. "Miss Graves," he said, "I am going to ask you something, and I want you to refuse me." Eleanor blinked. "That is an unusual preface to a request." "I want you to refuse me because I want you to know that you can. That refusal is an option, that what I am about to say carries no obligation, no expectation, no consequence if your answer is no." "You are making me nervous." "Good. You should be nervous. I am terrified." He stood. He did not kneel. That would come later, in a different church, on a different day. But he stood before her, with his hands at his sides and his gray eyes open and undefended in a way that she suspected very few people had ever seen. "Marry me," he said. Eleanor stared at him. "I know," he continued. "We have known each other for 3 hours. We have exchanged 31 letters. I am a duke. You are a woman who is not permitted to use her own name. The entire proposition is absurd, premature, and socially indefensible. I am asking anyway." "Why?" Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I have spent 7 years surrounded by people who want my title, my money, my influence, my connections. Not one of them has ever wanted my mind. You are the only person who has ever written back to me, not because of who I am, but because of what I think, and I cannot go back to the silence of that. I will not." Eleanor stood. The distance between them was less than 2 feet. She could see the ink on his cuff, and the faint lines around his eyes that came from reading too long by candlelight, and the slight tremble in his jaw that told her the composure was costing him everything. "No," she said. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, but she saw it. "Not because I do not want to," she said, "but because you are doing what every man in my life has done. You are seeing what I can do for you, my writing, my mind, my usefulness, and calling it love. My aunt saw a companion. You see an essayist. Neither of you has asked who I am when I am not performing." The words landed like stones in still water. Sebastian was silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything, title, power, rhetoric, until what remained was simply a man, standing in a church, being told the truth. "You are right," he said. "I am sorry." Eleanor had not expected an apology. She had expected argument, deflection, the wounded pride of a man unaccustomed to rejection. The apology disarmed her more completely than any grand gesture could have. "I am going to leave now," she said. "Not because I want to, but because I need to be back before Lady Ashton returns, and because I need to think, and I cannot think clearly when you are standing this close to me." "May I write to you?" "You have been writing to me for 2 years." "May I continue?" She looked at him. He looked at her. The church was silent, except for the distant sound of wind in the yew trees and the ticking of a clock that neither of them could see. "Yes," she said, "you may continue." She left the church. She walked back along the lane, past the mill, through the gate, up the lime-tree avenue. She entered the kitchen door. She removed her cloak. She sat in the parlor and picked up her mending. When Lady Ashton returned at noon, she found her companion exactly where she had left her, silent, obedient, invisible. She did not notice that Eleanor's hands were shaking. The letters continued through April and into May. 2 per week, carried by peers, exchanged at the post office in Hartfield. They were, for both of them, the most important writing either had ever done. More important than Sebastian's parliamentary speeches, more important than Eleanor's published essays, because in those letters they were not performing for an audience. They were simply talking to each other, with the raw, unprotected honesty of 2 people who had been lonely for a very long time and who had found, in words on a page, the thing they had not known they were missing. His first letter after the church was 4 pages. It was the most honest thing he had ever written. He told her about the boy who had preferred books to horses and had been told by his father that this made him weak. He told her about the man who had married a beautiful woman and discovered that beauty, without kindness, is a form of cruelty. He told her about the Duke who had learned to use power as a shield and who had been hiding behind it for so long that he was not certain he remembered what his face looked like without the armor, and he asked the question she had demanded of him: "Who are you when you are not performing?" She answered on the backs of discarded recipes from the kitchen, in handwriting so small that reading it required the kind of patience that Sebastian had already demonstrated. "I am a woman who thinks in arguments, not quarrels, structures. I see a problem and I build a framework around it the way an architect builds a frame around a house. My father taught me this. It is the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me. I am a woman who is angry, not the sharp, hot anger that burns and fades, the slow kind, the kind that builds foundations. My anger has kept me alive in this house, and I am not ashamed of it, though I suspect the world would prefer that I were. I am a woman who is afraid, not of poverty, not of solitude. I am afraid of being seen and then unseen, of being valued and then discarded. Your wife saw your title and not you. My aunt saw my utility and not me. The pattern is the same. You and I are both people who have been loved for the wrong reasons, and I think we are both terrified of it happening again. I am a woman who has not said her own name in 4 years, and who said it to you in a dining room and felt, for the first time since her father died, real. That is who I am." He wrote back, "I do not know if I am what you need. I suspect you need very little from anyone, which is one of the things I admire most about you. But I know that you are what I need. Not your essays, not your mind, though I value it beyond measure. You, the woman who told me I was wrong and then explained exactly how. The woman who cited footnote 12. The woman who said her name in a dining room and broke something open inside me that I did not know was closed. I will not ask you to marry me again, not until you are free, not until you have your name back and your money back and your notebooks back and every single thing that was stolen from you. And when you have all of that, if you still want a man who reads too much and debates too fiercely and has ink on his cuffs that he cannot seem to remove no matter how hard he scrubs, then I will ask, and I will not mind if you say no again. I will mind very much, but I will not stop asking." But words on a page were not enough. Sebastian knew this. Eleanor knew this, and the situation at Ashton House was becoming untenable. Lady Ashton had noticed something. She could not have identified what it was. Eleanor was too careful, too practiced in the art of invisibility. But some animal instinct for control told her that something had shifted. Her companion was different. The quality of her silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of waiting. Lady Ashton responded the way she always responded to threats she could not identify. She tightened her grip. Eleanor's movements were restricted further. Her room was inspected twice weekly instead of monthly. Her interaction with the servants was monitored, and then came the assembly. The Hartfield Spring Assembly was held annually in the assembly rooms above the Coaching Inn, a modest affair by London standards, but the most significant social event in the village calendar. Lady Ashton attended every year, with Beatrice on display and Eleanor in attendance as the silent, colorless companion who held shawls and fetched punch and stood against the wall with the particular posture of a woman who has learned that walls are safer than open spaces. This year, something changed. It happened during the interval. Eleanor was standing near the refreshment table, holding 2 glasses of punch that no one had asked for and no one would thank her for, when Mrs. Carmichael, the wife of the local magistrate, a woman who prided herself on knowing everyone's business and sharing it at maximum volume, approached Beatrice with a compliment so ornate it was practically a speech. "Miss Ashton, you are the jewel of the evening, such grace, such elegance. Your mother must be so proud. Tell me, dear, who designed that exquisite gown?" Beatrice, trained to a shine, named the dressmaker and smiled. Mrs. Carmichael beamed. Then her gaze drifted, as it always did, toward the invisible figure behind Beatrice. "And who is this? I see her at every event, but I confess I have never caught her name." The question was casual, innocent, the kind of question anyone might ask. Lady Ashton moved with a speed that revealed how prepared she was for exactly this moment. She stepped forward, placed her hand on Mrs. Carmichael's arm, and said in a voice loud enough for the surrounding cluster of women to hear, "This is my companion. She has no name worth mentioning. She is useful with linen and tolerable with correspondence, and I keep her on as a charity to my late sister. Please do not trouble yourself." The words fell across the room like a slap. Several women nearby turned. Some had the grace to look uncomfortable. Most did not. Eleanor stood perfectly still. She held the 2 glasses of punch. She did not flinch. She did not blush. She looked straight ahead with the practiced, frozen composure of a woman who has been publicly humiliated so many times that her body has learned to absorb the blow the way a boxer absorbs a punch, by going still, by tightening every muscle, by refusing to give the audience the satisfaction of watching her fall. But inside, something fundamental shifted. She has no name worth mentioning. 7 words, spoken in public, in front of the entire village, by the woman who had stolen her name in private and now was stealing it in the open, in a room full of witnesses, with the casual public contempt of someone who no longer even bothered to hide what she was doing. Eleanor looked down at the 2 glasses of punch in her hands. She looked at the crowd of women who had heard and said nothing. She looked at Beatrice, who was studying the hem of her own gown with the fixed concentration of someone who has decided not to see what is happening directly in front of her. And she made a decision. She set the glasses down on the table. She turned. She walked toward the door of the assembly room. Lady Ashton's voice followed, her sharp with surprise. "Where are you going? I did not give you permission to leave." Eleanor stopped at the door. She turned. Every eye in the room was on her, the woman they had looked through for 4 years, suddenly, inexplicably, refusing to be invisible. "My name," Eleanor said, "is Eleanor Graves." The room went silent. "I am the daughter of Edmund Graves and Anne Whitfield Graves. I have been a guest in Lady Ashton's home for 4 years. I am not a servant. I am not a charity case. I am a woman with a name, and I have just heard it publicly denied for the last time." She looked at Lady Ashton. Lady Ashton's face was white with fury, the particular fury of a woman whose property has suddenly developed opinions. "I will be in my room," Eleanor said, "packing." She walked out. She did not pack, not yet. She went to her room and sat on the bed and shook with the aftermath of what she had done. The adrenaline hit like a wave, trembling hands, racing heart, the metallic taste of fear in her mouth. She had just confronted Lady Ashton in public. She had just spoken her name in front of every woman in the village. She had just, for the first time in 4 years, refused. The punishment would come. It always came. But when she thought about Sebastian's letter, "I will not ask you to marry me again until you are free," she understood something with absolute clarity. She could not wait for him to free her. She could not wait for a duke to ride in and dismantle her cage. She had to walk out of it herself, on her own legs, through her own door, speaking her own name. What happened next, she would do alone, and she would do it tomorrow. The next morning, Eleanor Graves did something she had not done in 4 years. She made a choice. Not the choice Sebastian expected, not the choice Lady Ashton feared. A different choice, her own. She went to Lady Ashton's study. She knocked on the door. She entered without waiting for permission. Lady Ashton was at her desk, reviewing correspondence. She looked up with the reflexive irritation of a woman interrupted during an activity she considered important by a person she considered insignificant. But there was something else in her expression, a wariness. Last night's assembly had cracked something in the dynamic between them, and Lady Ashton knew it. She could feel the shift the way an animal feels the change in air pressure before a storm. "What is it?" Lady Ashton said. "My name," Eleanor said, "is Eleanor Graves." Lady Ashton's pen stopped. "My father was Edmund Graves. My mother was your sister, Anne. I have been living in this house for 4 years, during which time you have taken my name, my notebooks, my correspondence, and my wages. You have also concealed from me the fact that my father's debt to you was repaid in full 2 years ago. which means that I have been working for you without legal obligation and without compensation for 24 months. The color drained from Lady Ashton's face, not with guilt, with the fury of exposure. And beneath the fury, the unmistakable flash of fear. She had not known that Eleanor knew about the debt. "I am leaving," Eleanor said. "Today, now. I am taking my cloak, my father's watch, my mother's comb, and the 11 guineas that I earned with my writing, and that you did not manage to steal because I hid them better than you looked." "You ungrateful—" "I am not finished." Eleanor's voice was level, steady. The voice of a woman who has spent 4 years composing this speech, not on paper, but in the architecture of her mind, building it word by word the way she built her essays, with evidence, with logic, with the controlled fire of someone who is angry enough to burn and disciplined enough to direct the flame. "I will also be taking the 14 notebooks that you confiscated from my room in the spring of 1842 and placed in the lower left drawer of this desk. They contain my private writing. They are my property. You had no legal right to take them because I was not your employee, and my personal possessions were never part of any arrangement between us." Lady Ashton stood. "You will not—" "The key to the drawer," Eleanor said, "is on the ring at your waist, the 3rd key from the left. I have been watching you open it for 4 years." The silence that followed was different from any silence Eleanor had experienced in this house. It was not the silence of submission. It was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of power shifting. The quiet, seismic moment when a person who has been controlled realizes that the person controlling them has known the exact dimensions of their cage all along and has been waiting patiently and methodically for the door to open. Lady Ashton's hand went to her waist. She looked at the key ring. She looked at Eleanor. And for the first time in 4 years, her eyes held something other than contempt. They held fear. Eleanor held out her hand. "The key, Lady Ashton." Lady Ashton gave her the key. Eleanor unlocked the drawer. She removed the 14 notebooks. "And this is the moment." She held them against her chest, both arms wrapped around them. 14 notebooks, 4 years of her thoughts, 4 years of her mind, 4 years of the only proof she had that she existed, pressed against her body, against her beating heart, held with a ferocity that was not anger and not relief, but something larger and more primal than either. The way a mother holds a recovered child, the way a drowning person holds a rope, the way a woman holds the only evidence that she is real. Her eyes filled, her throat closed, her shoulders began to shake. She did not try to stop it. Not this time. Not in front of Lady Ashton. Let her see. Let her see what she did. Let her see the cost of 4 years, measured not in pounds and shillings, but in the body of a woman holding her own thoughts and weeping with the desperate, gasping relief of someone who has just gotten back the thing that makes her herself. Lady Ashton watched. Something moved in her expression, not remorse, not yet, perhaps not ever, but recognition. The mirror she had been avoiding for 4 years, finally, inescapably clear. Eleanor breathed. She straightened. She wiped her eyes with the back of one hand, the other still pressed against the notebooks. She did not apologize for the tears. She did not explain them. She turned and walked to the door. "If you leave this house," Lady Ashton said, her voice tight with the particular desperation of a woman who senses that something she valued only in its absence is about to be permanently lost, "you will have nothing. No name, no position, no protection. The world will eat you alive." Eleanor stopped at the door. She turned. "My name is Eleanor Graves," she said. "I have published 15 essays in the London Political Examiner. I have 11 guineas in my cloak, and 14 notebooks under my arm and a mind that you could not break no matter how hard you tried. That is not nothing, Lady Ashton. That is everything." She walked out. She walked down the servants' corridor, down the stairs, through the kitchen, where the cook looked up from her bread and stared, past the garden where she had pressed her forehead against the potting shed wall and shaken with silent rage, down the lime tree avenue, through the gate, and onto the road to Hartfield. She did not look back. She did not go to Sebastian, not immediately, not because she did not want to, but because Eleanor Graves had spent 4 years being moved from one person's house to another, and the first thing she intended to do with her freedom was stand still. She went to the coaching inn in Hartfield. She paid for a room with her own money. She sat on the bed and opened her notebooks and read them, one by one. All 14, 4 years of her own thoughts returned to her. Then she wrote a letter, not to Sebastian, to the editor of the London Political Examiner. "Dear Sir, I write to inform you that a Pemberton is a pseudonym. My name is Eleanor Graves. I am a woman. I am 28 years old. I have no university education, no social position, and no resources other than my mind and my pen. I am aware that this disclosure may affect your willingness to continue publishing my work. If so, I understand. But I will not write under a false name again. I have spent 4 years being denied my own, and I find that I am no longer willing to surrender it for anyone's comfort, including my own. I have enclosed my 16th essay. It is, I believe, my best. If you wish to publish it under my name. If you do not, return it, and I will find someone who will. Yours sincerely, Eleanor Graves." She posted the letter herself at the village post office with her own hand. The postmaster looked at her with the quiet recognition of a man who had been storing Pemberton's correspondence for 4 years, and who had suspected, though he had never said, that the young woman who sometimes accompanied the under-footman to collect the letters was not merely a messenger. "Good morning, Miss Graves," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Harding." It was, she thought, the most beautiful exchange of names she had ever been part of. Then she wrote to Sebastian, "Mr. Hale, I have left Ashton House. I am at the coaching inn in Hartfield. I have my notebooks, my money, and my name. I obtained all 3 myself. I did not come to you because I need you to understand something. I am not a problem for you to solve. I am not a woman who requires rescue. I am a person who is imprisoned, and I have freed myself. And the first thing I choose to do with that freedom is not to walk into another man's house, however kind and however good, but to stand in a room I have paid for with money I earned and breathe. I will come to London when I am ready. I will see you when I choose to. And if, when I arrive, you still want to marry a woman who will argue with you about Bentham and refuse your proposals and cite footnotes by number and insist always on being addressed by her name, then we can discuss it. But I will not be acquired, Sebastian. Not by my aunt, not by you, not by anyone. I will be chosen, and I will choose in return." Eleanor Sebastian received the letter on a Friday afternoon. He read it in his study at Berkeley Square, the same study where the new decanter sat on the sideboard and the dent in the wall had been covered, on the valet's recommendation, by a small painting. He read it twice. He set it down. He pressed his hands against the desktop and breathed. Then he laughed. Not the small, controlled laugh of a man performing amusement. A real laugh, full and unguarded and raw, the laugh of a man who has just been refused by the woman he loves and who understands for the first time in his life that being refused by the right person is infinitely better than being accepted by the wrong one. He picked up his pen. His reply was 3 sentences. "Miss Graves, I will wait. The door will remain open. Eleanor came to London 3 weeks later. She came on her own terms, in a carriage she hired with her own money, wearing a dress she had purchased at a shop in Hartfield. Not fine, not fashionable, but hers. She came not because Sebastian had asked, but because the editor of the London Political Examiner had written back. He wanted to meet her. He wanted to publish the 16th essay under her real name. And he wanted to discuss a regular column. She stood at the door of 34 Berkeley Square on a Tuesday evening in June, with her notebooks under her arm and her father's watch warm against her chest, and she knocked. A butler opened the door. He looked at the woman in the plain dress with the 14 notebooks and the expression of someone who has walked a very long way and is not yet tired. "Miss Graves," the butler said, without being told her name. "His Grace is expecting you. He has been expecting you for 3 weeks. Shall I show you to the library?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "The library would be perfect." The library at 34 Berkeley Square was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on every wall, a fire burning low in the grate, 2 armchairs positioned at angles that suggested conversation, and on the desk by the window, arranged in a neat stack, 12 volumes, every book that Eleanor had written in the margins of during her 4 years at Ashton House. Sebastian had purchased them, every one. He had gone to Ashton House after Eleanor's departure, before Lady Ashton could sell or discard them, and he had bought them. Not for himself, for Eleanor. He was standing by the window when she entered. He turned. He looked at her. The notebooks, the plain dress, the fierce brown eyes, and he did not speak. She looked at the books on the desk. She understood what they meant. She crossed the room, picked up the volume of Adam Smith, and opened it to the page where she had written her first marginal note 4 years ago, in the dark, with a pencil stub, while Lady Ashton slept. Her handwriting, her thoughts, her mind, preserved on the page. "You bought them," she said. "They are yours," Sebastian said. "Everything in them is yours. The ideas, the arguments, the anger, all of it." She set the book down. She looked at him across the library, across the distance that had been closing for 2 years, through letters, through a church meeting, through a rejection, through a departure, through the long, difficult, necessary work of becoming free. "Ask me," she said. He blinked. "Ask you what?" "You said you would not ask until I was free. I am free. My name is Eleanor Graves. I have 15 published essays and an offer for a 16th. I have my notebooks. I have my money. I have a mind that no one managed to break. Ask me." He crossed the room. He stood before her. He was close enough that she could see the ink on his cuff, both cuffs this time, and the slight tremble in his jaw that she had seen once before in a church in Hertfordshire. "Eleanor Graves," he said, "will you marry me? Not because I need your mind, though I do. Not because I want to protect you, though I would burn London to the ground if anyone threatened you. But because for 2 years you have been the only person who told me the truth, and I find that I cannot live without it. I cannot live without you." She looked at him. The library was silent except for the pop of the fire and the distant sound of a carriage on Berkeley Square. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, a sound so raw with relief that it broke something open in her chest. "Yes," she said again, "on one condition." "Name it." "You will never call me companion. You will never call me Mrs. Hale because it is convenient. You will never introduce me as the Duchess of Ashworth because the title is easier than the name. My name is Eleanor. You will use it every day, every time. You will say it until it is the most natural word in your vocabulary, because for 4 years no one said it, and I will never ever allow that to happen again. "Eleanor," he said. The word came out like a prayer. "Eleanor, Eleanor, Eleanor." She kissed him. She rose on her toes and put her hands on his face, his angular, serious, imperfect face, and she kissed the Duke of Ashworth in his library, surrounded by books she had written in and words she had hidden, and a lifetime of thoughts that had finally, after 28 years of searching, found a home. He kissed her back. His arms came around her, one hand pressed flat against the small of her back, the other cradling the back of her head, and he held her with the careful, fierce desperation of a man who has been alone for 7 years and who understands, with the humility of someone who has been refused and forgiven and chosen, that he has done nothing to deserve this except wait. When they pulled apart, his forehead resting against hers, his breath unsteady, she said, "You have ink on both cuffs." "I always have ink on my cuffs," he said. "I have been writing to you for 2 years. Do you know what that does to a man's cuffs?" "I know what it does to a man's arguments," she said. "Your penmanship deteriorates significantly after page 3. I have always assumed that is when the brandy arrives." He laughed, the real laugh, the rare one, the one that cracked open his face and let light in. And he pulled her closer, and the library filled with a sound it had not held in 7 years, the sound of 2 people, together, at home. The destruction of Lady Ashton was not dramatic. It was comprehensive. Sebastian's solicitors filed suit in Chancery for the fraudulent concealment of a discharged debt, 2 years of unpaid labor extracted through deception. The case was heard the following Michaelmas term. Lady Ashton hired a barrister who read the evidence, blanched visibly, and recommended immediate settlement. Lady Ashton refused. She was a woman who had never conceded anything in her life, and she was not about to start in a courtroom. The judgment was swift. The court found in Eleanor's favor. Lady Ashton was ordered to pay restitution, back wages calculated at a companion's market rate for 24 months, plus the stolen payments from the examiner, plus legal costs, plus damages for what the judge described, in language that was quoted in the newspapers the following day as a pattern of deliberate and sustained deception designed to deny the plaintiff her legal rights, her personal property, and her fundamental identity. The financial total was modest by ducal standards. It was devastating by Lady Ashton's. But the judgment was not the real punishment. The real punishment was the 16th essay. Eleanor published it in the London Political Examiner in July of 1843, under her own name. It was titled, "On the Economics of Silence: How English Law Permits the Erasure of Women." It was a systematic, evidenced, devastating analysis of the legal mechanisms, guardianship, coverture, the absence of contractual rights for companions, that allowed women to be stripped of their names, their labor, and their identities by the people who were supposed to protect them. It used no names. It named no houses, but every drawing-room in Hertfordshire recognized the story, and every woman who had ever been a companion or a governess or a dependent relation recognized herself. The essay was reprinted in 4 other periodicals. It was read aloud in Parliament by a member who championed it as evidence for legal reform. It was discussed, debated, praised, and condemned across England. And at the bottom, in print for all the world to see, was the name that Lady Ashton had tried to erase. Eleanor Graves, not A. Pemberton, not companion, not no one. Eleanor Graves. Beatrice married the following year. Not a duke. Lady Ashton's social reputation had been too thoroughly damaged for that. But a respectable country gentleman named Mr. Edward Wells, who loved her with a kindness that did not require performance, and who, to his considerable credit, never once asked Beatrice to be anyone other than herself. Eleanor sent a wedding gift, a book of Wordsworth, inscribed simply, "From Eleanor." She and Beatrice were never close, but they exchanged letters twice a year, brief and factual and signed with their own names, which was, in its quiet way, enough. Piers was offered a position at Berkeley Square. He accepted. He became Sebastian's under-butler within 2 years, and eventually the most fiercely loyal member of the Ashworth household staff. When visitors asked how he had come to serve the Duke, he would say only, "I carried the letters." He never explained further. He did not need to. Lady Ashton withdrew from society. The Hertfordshire drawing-rooms that had once been her domain closed their doors, not because of the court judgment, but because of the essay. Eleanor had not named her. She did not need to. The truth has its own gravity, and the people who had watched Eleanor sit at the end of Lady Ashton's table in a dishwater dress and answer to "companion" for 4 years understood, with the clarifying force of hindsight, exactly what they had witnessed and exactly what they had failed to do about it. Lady Ashton ended her days in a smaller house, in a quieter village, with a single servant and a locked drawer that she refused to open, though it contained nothing now except empty space where 14 notebooks had once been. She did not write to Eleanor. There was nothing to say, but she kept on her bedside table a copy of the London Political Examiner containing the 16th essay, and whether she kept it as punishment or proof, or the closest thing to a mirror she could stand to look into, only she knew. Eleanor and Sebastian married in September. Not at St. George's in Hanover Square, where dukes were expected to marry. At St. Michael's, the old church in Hartfield, where they had first spoken to each other as themselves. The guest list was small. The editor of the London Political Examiner, Piers, who was now 17 and who served as a witness and wept openly throughout the ceremony, Sebastian's mother, the Dowager Duchess, who had travelled from Ashworth Park with the bemused curiosity of a woman who had expected her son to marry a diamond and had instead gotten a volcano, and who, after 30 minutes of conversation with Eleanor about agricultural policy over the wedding breakfast, turned to Sebastian and said, "She is magnificent. You do not deserve her." Sebastian, for the first time in his mother's memory, agreed without argument. Eleanor wore white, simple, no diamonds, no elaborate lace. She wore her mother's tortoise-shell comb in her hair and her father's watch on a ribbon around her wrist, and she carried a small book of Bentham, which made Sebastian laugh so hard the vicar paused the ceremony. When the vicar asked for her name, she spoke it clearly, without hesitation, without a crack in her voice. Eleanor Graves. And then, because she chose to, because choice was the foundation of everything, she added, "Soon to be Eleanor Hale." Sebastian took her hands. His cuffs were clean for once, which Eleanor suspected had required significant effort from his valet, and which she suspected would not last past dinner. His grey eyes were warm and wet and entirely undefended. "I vow," he said, and then stopped because the prepared words had disappeared and what remained was simply the truth. "I vow to say your name every day. I vow to argue with you about Bentham and Mill and footnotes on page 47. I vow to keep ink on my cuffs and your books on my shelves and your voice in my life for as long as I live. And I vow that no one will ever take your name again. And I vow," Eleanor said, her eyes shining, "to never be silent again." They married. They kissed. Piers sobbed. The Dowager Duchess dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief and pretended she wasn't. The vicar looked relieved. That evening, in the library at Berkeley Square, Sebastian found Eleanor in the armchair by the fire, Her notebook open, her pencil moving across the page. The firelight caught her hair and turned it copper. Her feet were tucked beneath her. Her brow was furrowed in the way that meant she was building an argument, constructing it brick by brick, and that anyone who interrupted her before she had finished would receive the full force of her displeasure. He sat in the opposite chair. He picked up a book. He opened it to a random page and pretended to read while actually watching her write, the way he had been watching her for 2 years through her words, and was now, at last, permitted to watch in person. The fire all crackled. Rain tapped against the windows. The library smelled of paper and ink and the particular warmth that accumulates in rooms where people are doing the 2 things they love most in the world, reading and being together. "Sebastian," Eleanor said without looking up. "Yes?" "Thank you for asking my name." He set down his book. He looked at her, his wife, his essayist, his equal, the woman who had been erased and who had written herself back into existence. And he said the only word that mattered. "Eleanor." She looked up. She smiled, not the careful, guarded smile she had worn like armor for 4 years. A real smile, the kind that starts in the eyes and works its way outward until it transforms the entire face, until it fills the room, until it reaches the man sitting in the opposite chair and makes him understand, with a certainty that no parliamentary debate and no solicitor's report and no library full of books could ever have given him, that he has finally, at last, come home. "Eleanor," he said again, softer, like he was learning the word for the first time, like it was the first word of a language he intended to speak for the rest of his life. The fire burned low. The rain continued. And in the library at Berkeley Square, a woman who had been called No One wrote her 17th essay, and the man who loved her pretended to read, and did not pretend to stop smiling, and the clock on the mantel ticked away the first hours of a life they would build together, word by word, argument by argument, name by name. And that, my friends, is the story of the woman they called No One, and the Duke who said her name, and the 14 notebooks that held a mind that could not be broken. Thank you for being here tonight. Every listen, every comment, every subscription builds this community, and this community is built on the belief that your name matters, that you matter, that the person you are when no one is watching is the person most worth knowing. If this story made you feel something, tell me about it in the comments. Which moment stayed with you? Was it the dinner table, when she spoke her name for the first time in 4 years? Was it the church, when he asked and she said no? The assembly rooms, when she stood up and said it in front of everyone? The moment she held those notebooks against her chest and finally let herself cry? Or was it the library at Berkeley Square, when she said, "Ask me," and he finally did? Drop your answer below. I read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, join this community. The next story is already taking shape, and I promise you, it will be just as intense. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, your name is yours. It always was. It always will be. And anyone who tells you otherwise has simply not met the person who will say it the way it deserves to be said. Good night, my friends. I will see you in the next one.